Hello, everyone, and welcome to July 9th. It is a rainy July 9th here in Wilmington, Delaware. And I'm Eric Allen, founder of Planivaudio, and this is the Planivaudio Travel Podcast. Today, I want to talk about the decision to make between taking a road trip while you travel versus taking a flight. Now, this is it sounds like it should be a really easy decision. If I know somebody who's going to take a road trip somewhere, then typically that person's already decided long in advance, hey, I'm going on a road trip. But, things are changing these days. And if we recall to the most recent podcast where we discussed the cost of flights and the constant delays and cancellations that we're experiencing today, it's almost something that we need to start talking about more often now, because I feel like the likeliness that people are going to be taking more road trips is going to begin to increase. All right. So just to kind of recap on what we were talking about last week, in the United States right now, we are experiencing what I would like to consider a trickle-down effect. Okay. COVID changed the landscape for a lot of things. It changed it. It changed the way a lot of people live. It changed the way a lot of people, conduct their business, and it even changed how businesses conduct employee management. I can remember several years ago reading articles about how, it was not such a beneficial thing to do to have employees working from home, because let's be honest, how do you quantify that process? How do you verify that your employee is actually logging that time that you're paying them for? So if you're paying an employee for 40 hours a week, for all they could be docking, a very minimal amount. They could be putting in 20 hours of work that week, and you get to pay the bill for the other 20 hours of them doing nothing more than just getting out of bed and walking to the dining room. So there is a lot to consider when making those decisions to transition to, home employment or remote work, we'll say. And I would say that cost is a big one of them. But also, I believe that COVID probably changed the landscape in the way that companies now found creative ways to be accountable for that time. There's ways you can digitally clock in when you get to work. You can start recording your time. You can update progress on the work that you're working on. So there are ways to establish accountability. But the point is, things changed several years ago. So, today what we're experiencing is the impact of those changes. Now, when it comes to travel, one of the things that we saw and that we also discussed last week was the airlines were experiencing early retirements, forced retirements, layoffs to try to save those costs. I mean, let's be honest, airlines are not nationalized. They're for-profit companies. So whenever a for-profit company has employees that are not doing work, typically it's not beneficial to them to allow those employees to stay on the payroll for nothing. So, they find creative ways to try to minimize that impact, to minimize their costs, and quite frankly, to avoid going bankrupt or running out of money. When a company is out of money, typically that's the end of the road for the company. So we've seen COVID affect a lot of things. We've seen COVID change the way that the rental car industry has conducted its business. And even now it's starting to bounce back. But once COVID hit and there was a significantly less number of drivers on the road and drivers renting vehicles, those companies had to figure out ways to recover those lost profits. And what they did was they ended up selling off a lot of their fleet. And then next thing you know, 2021 comes along, 2022 comes along, travel starts to pick back up, and we realize that these rental car agencies don't have the fleet to support the demand anymore, which is why you saw the prices of a rental car jump up to about 175% of their 2019 numbers. So, everything has a trickle-down effect. Everything has a reaction, right? So what we're experiencing when it comes to travel today is a reaction to things that were decided upon or that occurred 2 years ago. All right. Just like I said last week, the problems that we're facing in the travel industry today, especially when it comes to flight cancellations and flight delays, it doesn't have to do with decisions that were made a week ago or 2 weeks ago. No, the problem with what we're experiencing in the flight delays and flight cancellation category today is something that started 2 years ago. Even before then, you can look back, why were the airlines seeing an increasingly high number of pilots that were nearing their retirement age and not enough pilots coming in to replenish those numbers? If there's one thing that COVID taught us, it's that you can always expect the unexpected. It's weird. I mean, everything's just going one way, and next thing you know, things in life just dramatically change, and next thing you know, we are all reeling and fighting over toilet paper. So it's just the way the world works. It's scary at times, but the point is that when this thing happened to us 2 years ago, it changed a lot of the way the world operates. Okay. And when it comes to travel, one of the things that we saw was travel was significantly impacted, but not immediately. On the immediate scale, the way it was impacted was there wasn't enough volume. I used to take a flight that was direct from Philadelphia to Munich, Germany. That was great. No layovers in between. Everything was perfect. American Airlines was my airline of choice. I got my frequent flyer mile card with them, and everything was looking good. And then COVID hits, and boom, next thing you know, now every time I go there, I'm doing a layover in either Detroit, Charlotte, Washington, or Atlanta. I don't prefer it. It's just the way things are. So everything has changed. And today, when we look at a decision, when we're looking at travel, right? And for today's scenario, let's just say that we're a family of four. You got a husband and wife, 2 kids, and we want to travel down to Florida. And we're going to use New York as our base. Okay. So we're going to say we want to go from New York to Florida. And we have, let's say in this scenario that both parents have 2 weeks off of work. The kids are on summer break, and the parents want to fly down to Florida, but now they have some things to consider, and we'll say that we want to do a week in Florida. Okay. So when we look at these things, we have a lot to decide, right? We have a lot of choices to make when it comes to travel. I'm not going to say that people haven't always thought about, do I drive or do I fly? But today, because the way gas prices are, the way that the airlines are increasing their prices, which is not significantly higher than it was years ago, but prices have increased. And of course, during the high seasons, we're going to feel that more. During the lower seasons, we're still going to feel it, but not as bad, although it's going to be higher than it was years ago. And of course, that is just the way that the world works. It's the way the economy works. Of course, we're not paying ticket prices for an airliner, similar to what we paid in 1985. It just doesn't work that way. Everything climbs, everything inflates over time, and everything just slowly increases in price. But typically, prices will try to keep up with that. Wages will try to keep up with that. There's ways to try to offset that. And of course, one of the things that I try to teach people is there's ways to, I don't want to say manipulate, but there's ways to work the system where the impact of some of these choices, some of these changes, and some of these costs is not as significant on you as they need to be, or as they typically are. So again, let's just say we have a scenario. Mom, dad, 2 kids, summer break, parents got 2 weeks off. They want to spend a week in Florida, and now they're sitting down trying to decide, do I fly or do I drive? So what I did was I went ahead and I'll just move away from Planiversity's landing page here. And I pulled up Microsoft Whiteboard. So what I'd like to break everything down to is when we're making a decision to drive, fly, or even take a train, some of the things that you have to consider are your time, your costs, and your stress levels. You never forget your stress levels. So you can see here, if you can see the diagram, we've got cost in green, we've got stress in red because we don't like stress, and we've got time in blue. Now, of course, there's other variables. It's just a matter of convenience sometimes. Like, it's the summer months. Some airlines won't travel with animals in the airplane during the summer months because of they can't control the heat underneath the airplane. So maybe you want to travel during the summer months, you have to take the dog with you, and it's just not an option. So flying is off the table. Now we're driving. That's not always the case, but there are other factors to consider besides just time, cost, and stress. But I'm leading this discussion, and for me, this is what I consider to be the most important points to consider when we're thinking about which mode of travel we're going to decide on for a trip. So let's get into it. All right, let's talk about this. Let's take a sip of coffee first. Hopefully, if you're driving, you have a cup of coffee by, and if you don't have one nearby, then you can stop and grab one. Hopefully, you have something. So today, let's talk about cost first. So cost, the average cost, there's all sorts of statisticians out there and people doing the math on these things. And they found out today that the average cost of a plane ticket in the United States for a domestic flight is $330. All right, $330. Doesn't seem that bad. This is the average, right? So we're not talking about these long distance flights, okay? Every flight is long distance to a certain degree, but we're not talking about the extremes. I'm not talking about the Seattle to Miami, completely across the country, opposite corners. I'm not talking about the Boston to Los Angeles. I'm talking about the average. So for those flights, those Miami to Seattle's, you might see $500-$600 prices on the tickets per person. And for the shorter flights, I booked recently a flight to go down to Florida with my son, and that cost me about $98 per person round trip. That was phenomenal. Now, of course, that doesn't include the additional costs. That doesn't include the, if you want to upgrade, there's an additional cost. If you have extra baggage, if you have any baggage to check or carry on, that's an additional cost. If you want to board early, if you want to pick your seat, if you want food or drink, all those things are additional costs. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about just a baseline ticket price just to get on there and get a flight from point A to point B. It's about $98 per person for that flight for Spirit. So you got on one end of the spectrum, $98, the other end of the spectrum, around $550, $600, and then you got everything in between, which today averages out to be about $330 per person for a domestic flight in the United States. So let's take mom, dad, and the two kids. You put all four together, and we'll be doing the math right here on my handy iPhone as we're talking about these things. So 330 times 4 brings us up to $1,320. So let's just say, what I block here, we'll say flight for 4 people is equal to, sorry about that, $1,300, if I can get my head out of the way so I can actually see the keyboard, $1,320. It seems a little pricey, right? And especially when we consider once you get to your destination, you're probably going to have to rent a car. You're going to have to pay for the gas for that car. You're going to have to rent a hotel unless you're staying with family. You might not have to rent a car if you're staying with family because maybe they have a car. But, in a lot of cases, people do not have family at those destinations, so they end up renting a car. But just for the flight, we're talking about flight for 4 people, $1,320. All right. Significant cost. Time for a flight. Let's just say the flight time. So I have flown from Germany to, or not Germany, I'm sorry. I've flown from New York to Florida, and the cost or the time that it takes to get from there for a flight is usually somewhere around 3 hours. Sometimes, depending on the headwinds and the tailwinds, your flight will become a little longer, a little bit shorter. But ordinarily, what I've seen to get from Florida up to the Northeast is somewhere around 3 hours. So let's just say we're going to use 3 hours, which tells me that our time impact is pretty minimal. All right. And then when we talk about stress, there's a lot of ways that we can go when it comes to stress. But stress for some people, going to an airport is stressful. You start adding kids, you add multiple people, you add baggage for 4 people, you add security check-ins and having to eat at the airport. Your stress levels are going to start to climb, your costs are going to start to climb. But let's just say ordinarily, your stress level at the airport is probably somewhere around a medium. Now, let's just say in an ideal scenario, you show up plenty of time in advance, maybe instead of going for 2 hours prior to your departure time, you show up 3 hours just to give yourself a little extra time to get from parking to the inside of the terminal and to the check-in, get through security, and you're not stressing, you're not racing. So let's put your stress level somewhere around a medium. Flight equals, I can't get this right today, medium amount of stress. So right now, this is what we're looking at, right? And I apologize if you can't see this because you're listening to just the audio version, but when we're talking about flying, now we're talking about higher impact of cost, lower impact of time, medium impact of stress. All right, so let's start building onto that. Today, the average statistical cost of a gallon of gasoline for regular unleaded is $4.69, and that is today. That means July 9th, 2022, not June 30th or any other time. This is July 9th. The average cost of fuel in this country is $4.69. All right, so I'm not going to go with the average size of a fuel tank, because some vehicles will just go forever. Some have larger. We have Teslas out there. We have electric vehicles. But let's just say if what you are is gassing a standard vehicle, my vehicle has about a 15-gallon capacity, right? So if I take $4.69 and I multiply that by 15 gallons, it's going to cost around somewhere in the ballpark of $70 just to fill my tank up, all right? So $70, I'm going to write this down on my little scratch pad here. And for a full tank, as long as ideal conditions exist, it's not raining, it's not snowing, the vehicle's not overweight, because if your vehicle is extremely heavy with suitcases, with people, with pets, etc., your engine's got to work harder to pull that weight, right? So maybe your fuel economy isn't that great after all. But typically I'll get somewhere around 400 miles. Okay, so 400 miles going from New York to Florida, we say we probably have to stop and fuel up 3 times along the way and then fuel up again once we get to our destination. Okay, so now we're talking that $70 times 4 times is $280. $280 to get myself to Florida. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll start adding on to this. Driving equals $280. Now wait. So we have to add on to this, right? We have to expand on this. So, depending on the type of person that you are, perhaps you, let's go ahead and bump this down to the next line, by the way. So if you're the type of person like me, when I was younger, when I was 25 years old, I could do 18 hours straight in a car. Today, I absolutely do not like being in a car more than 8 hours. All right. Well, let's just say if the drive time it takes to get from New York down to Orlando takes 18 hours, you might want to break that into 2 days. Okay. For me, I'm definitely breaking it into 2 days, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get a hotel room somewhere halfway in between, which would put you in the ballpark of the Carolinas, right? So we have to consider that if you decide to go straight through, now that is a different story, right? So if we say driving with stop, you have to add in there a hotel room, okay? So today, the average cost of a hotel room in the United States, just for today, is about $90. Now you're probably thinking, hey, I just come back from Chicago. I've just come back from Miami. There's no way I was paying $300 a night for a hotel room. Lower end, I was paying $180 a night. Well, you got to keep in mind, America is a large country. We have a huge rural area. And once you start getting outside the cities, you will not see those same price ranges. So if you are talking Miami, Chicago, Boston, sure. I would completely expect you to spend that kind of money. I would expect you to spend $250 a night, $200 a night on a room. But when you're talking about rural America, out in the middle of nowhere America, you will see rooms for $29 a night. You'll see motels offering a room for $39 a night, $45 a night, you name it. So there is the lower end of the spectrum. Okay, so you have the higher end, which you'll see rooms over $1,000, and then you have the lower end. You'll see rooms that are honestly really close to nothing. You know, you probably don't want to stay there, but in the middle of nowhere, maybe you don't have a choice. In any case, you have a lower end of the spectrum, and then you have everything in between. So let's go ahead and close that. So you have everything in between. So now we're talking about, we're in the Carolinas. You know, I could look up the price of a hotel somewhere in Central Carolina or North Carolina, but what I'm going to say is we're just going to go with the average price, okay? So we'll say that we're going to spend, you know, we have, you know, that's just a baseline. So if we say average cost of a hotel room is $90, now we're talking, we have 2 kids with us. Usually you get the baseline, and then you have, for every additional person, you'll have an additional cost. So, you know, we got the parents and 2 children, probably not going to fit them all in the same room unless we get a suite or a family room. And in that case, it's going to be a higher price because that's not really averaged in. So let's just say $180. Just take that average and we're going to multiply that by 2. Okay. So now we're up to $280 plus $100 or $180 for that hotel room for the one night. And now let's go ahead and say we're going to driving without. So driving without a stop, that's going to bring us right back down to $280. Or the fuel, right? But now let's talk about our stress levels and let's talk about our time. So if we want to factor this in, we're talking about time now. So we want to say driving with a stop is going to bring us up to right around 2 days. All right. So we had a flight of 3 hours versus now a stop while driving, while road trip, that's 2 days. Best case scenario, you decide to drive without a stop. And now we're talking 18 hours. All right. Now you might be thinking, okay, 18 hours isn't that big of a deal. I can push through that. I'll let my kids sleep. I'll let the wife sleep, whatever. Maybe dad wants to play hero. Maybe mom and dad want to swap on and off, and they do halves and halves, right? They just kind of make it through the night just to beat the traffic, whatever. There's all sorts of ways that you can kind of navigate this process. But if you decide to do that, what's going to happen to your stress level? It's going to rise dramatically, right? So if we decide to say, okay, let's just say driving with a stop is going to be medium amount of stress, right? Okay, so you were on your way down. You actually happen to stop in a hotel room, let the kids get out, stretch their legs, hit the swimming pool, grab some food, get some coffee, kind of refresh for the next day. You know what? I'm actually going to put that at a low level of stress, because if you have the time and you decide to drive, honestly, it's not going to affect your stress levels that much, especially if you don't put this level of pressure on yourself. Like, I have to get there by this time. I have to be there by that time. You're not going to stress yourself out too much if you're able to actually take your time. So my recommendation is, if you have a long drive, which a lot of people who decide to road trip, they plan those stops in there. If you don't plan a stop in there, now you're talking about putting some significant physiological stress on your body, and you're going to pay for that through fatigue and so on, right? But if you happen to be driving and you plan a stop in, well, now we're talking about your stress levels are going to come down, because now you're not trapped in the car, you're stretching, you're eating, you're resting, you're actually laying in a bed, and everything's good. So let's go ahead and we'll actually enter that. So driving now without a stop, now you're going to significantly increase your stress levels, because by the time you get to your destination, and I've been there, you are wiped out. Okay, this isn't for a 10-hour drive. This isn't for an 8-hour drive. Even a 10-hour drive, you're probably going to be pretty tired. But this is for down along the coast. Just imagine you want to drive from Chicago to San Antonio. You want to drive from Los Angeles to Denver. Those are pretty far drives. And if you decide to make it all in one trip, it's going to be pretty exhausting for you. Okay, so now let's talk about one last thing. So we decide to get a rental car when we get to our destination, or if we decide to fly, then we have to get a rental car, right? So now let's just come in here and we say, okay, average cost of a rental car, let's just put it at, maybe we're in the summer seasons, $65 a day. So we want to do a week. So if you have a really, really math savvy brain, unlike me, then you can figure that out quickly. But if not, then I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to do the math on my phone, and that brings us to $455 for a rental car. So let's go ahead and we want to say rental car. I can't type today. Rental car would be, now it wouldn't just be the $455, because now we're just talking about $455 baseline for the car. That's not including the fees. It's not including the taxes. It's not including whether or not you need insurance on top of that. That's not including whether or not you need a booster seat for a kid. So, realistically, you could end up, and now this is not an exact price, obviously, but this is just kind of a, maybe we're going to be in the ballpark of, let's just say $700 for the week for a rental car if you decide to do this. Okay. So now, if you're driving, you don't need that. Unless you have an older car and she's got some extra miles on her and you run into a maintenance issue, of course, your costs are going to go up. That's natural, right? If you blow a water pump, you blow the transmission, the master cylinder for your brakes, those are all going to cost you maintenance. But ideally, if you have a good vehicle, your vehicle's fine, it makes the trip no problem, then you don't have to pay for a rental car. The only thing you're going to have to cover is gasoline, in which case for a week you might have to fill up once or twice throughout that week. It's still, worst case scenario, $140, and then of course you're on your way back home unless the gas prices significantly jump after that. So does time factor into that decision for a rental car? No, not really. Distress, maybe the fact of having to rent a vehicle and pay that extra cost, pay for the insurance, or maybe you're stressed out because, if you get into an accident with it, then you got to pay some extra stuff. But, let's leave the time and stress out of this, because those aren't necessarily going to factor into every decision. But essentially, you can see where I'm going with this. So what I recommend is, if you're going to break this down and you really, really want to try to weigh the process and conduct this cost benefit analysis on whether or not you should be taking a road trip versus flying, my recommendation is put some kind of order of precedence on it, decide what the most important factors are to you. And for me, I'm always looking at three things. I'm looking at what it's going to cost me, how much time it's going to cost me, and if it's even worth the stress to deal with something. So again, personally, I don't mind a little bit extra cost if it takes my stress level down. I would rather spend a little bit of extra money, fly to a destination, arrive there rested in a shorter time, and have more time at my destination to kind of react to things and adjust. If I decide to take a road trip, that might significantly reduce my stress levels and costs, because now I'm like, well, I want to travel down the East Coast. I want to see some things. I want to, tour the landscape, and I don't mind if it's going to take me 2 or 3 days, because I have 2 weeks of vacation, right? When I was in Ireland a few months ago, I took a trip from Belfast all the way up to the north coast, and it was gorgeous. It's not something I ever would have wanted to fly from one location to another, because you'd be missing out on so many beautiful views of the coastline in Ireland. And the same thing goes with, being in Europe. You can drive from one location to another, or you can fly from one location to another. But believe me, there's a huge difference between driving through the Alps versus flying over the Alps. You can't buy those kind of views. So you really have to decide, if a road trip is something that you want, it's cost-wise, it's definitely the way to go, especially if you have a vehicle that can handle the trip. but you're going to save, even if gas prices are $6 a gallon, $7 a gallon. When it comes to fuel, if the fuel prices are that high, they're just going to translate over into the aviation industry anyway. So your tickets are going to go up just a little bit anyways to offset that cost. So my recommendation is, when you get to a point that you're trying to decide what it is that you want to do you want to take the road trip? Do you want to fly? Weigh it out. Write everything down, write out all the factors, sit down, analyze everything. And then once you decide to start categorizing these things and you really just write out these costs, you might come to some realizations that you would not have thought of just at the front of your head. You might see, hey, cost wise, this really isn't going to be a huge impact on me, but stress wise and time wise, this is going to be a huge impact on me, and I really don't want to deal with that. I don't want to be exhausted when I get to my destination. I don't want it to take 3 days to get to my destination. So, maybe I am willing to spend a little bit more money, or, vice versa. You might say, hey, look, I got the money to spend, but I only have 4 days, and I don't really feel like spending 2 days of that 4 days driving to my destination. I'd rather just get there, rent a car, or hopefully you go somewhere where there's, some kind of public transportation, and you work it that way. In any case, this is my recommendation. Weigh everything out, and you'll see at the end of the day, whatever you put precedence on, you'll be able to jot down all those details, and you'll actually be able to have some kind of tangible evidence of where the highest and lowest value is. And that should help you decide on whether or not a road trip is the way to go, or a flight. So I hope this helped. Please, if you have any questions, comments, anything you want us to start covering something, please just let us know. It's plans@planiversity.com. Always feel free to reach out to us. Social media is also an option. We're never strangers, and we don't want you to feel like one either. Hopefully you have a great day, and travel safe as always. We love hearing from you. Take care.